Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session with the most suspenseful title, Revealing the Secret Sauce. I came upon an article in Bon Appetit magazine that took issue with how the phrase secret sauce has been adopted by businesses and in everyday conversation. And the author said that to her, secret sauce will always refer to a secret concoction of messy goodness. And so we're joined by 5 individuals up here who have firsthand experience with the messy goodness that is a Convergence project. We are joined by Stuart Butler, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, who's been involved with the Health Reform Project, Building a Better Budget Process, and as Rob first said earlier, pretty much every other project Convergence has done. We are joined by Matt Owens, EVP and VP for Federal Relations at the Association of American Universities, who's involved in building a better budget process. Elizabeth Clay Roy, the Executive Director of Take Root Justice, who's part of the Working Up project. Kelly Young, who is pinch hitting. Kelly is the Executive Director of Education Reimagined. Unfortunately, Bobby McDonald, project stakeholder from Ed Reimagined, is unable to join us on account of travel woes. But thank you for stepping in, Kelly. And David Safavian, General Counsel of the American Conservative Union and Deputy Director of ACU Foundation's Center for Criminal Justice Reform, part of the Reentry Ready project. I'm just going to share a few framing thoughts before we get into the conversation. So the first is that the group of folks up here are a great illustration of the caliber of talent and depth of experience that Convergence is able to bring together for every project. Convergence stakeholders are people who have the knowledge, the influence to actually make a difference on the issue at hand. They span sectors, they span ideological views, and many other dimensions of diversity. What they have in common, though, is a willingness to show up to the process with curiosity, with decency, and with the kind of active hope that Congressman Kilmer described earlier. The second point is that, unlike Shake Shack, Convergence has made public the basic recipe for the secret sauce. It's right up there on the website. The 4 steps of the process, as they define it, are first to identify and research an issue, to convene stakeholders and build trust, to develop shared recommendations, and to take action. Of course, easier said than done, and we'll get into some of the complexities and challenges with our panelists. The last point I want to make is that while Convergence brings an art to the way that they engage stakeholders in the process, there's also a lot of science that undergirds what Convergence does. And through a mix of intention and intuition, Convergence has developed a process that draws on insights from social psychology, from neuroscience, from leadership theory, from conflict resolution, and a whole bunch of other disciplines. And what we're here to do today is really understand that process in more vivid terms through the reflections and stories of a handful of people who've been directly involved. So with that, let's dive in. We'd love to start by hearing from each of you. Just describe in a few sentences what led you to participate in Convergence's work and in the project you're involved in in the first place.
Well, as you mentioned, I've been involved in most of the projects in some way from the beginning. And I have to say that the reason that I got involved with Convergence is I've been working on public policy in Washington for 40 years. And so often I've seen opportunities for people to get together over that period that just fell apart in some way. People did not know how to get to yes. Things broke down. And it was very frustrating. And I think, like many of us, for many years, I thought, if only there was some organization that actually, could make this happen on a more consistent basis. And so that's why I was drawn to Convergence. And I think the techniques that you mentioned are so critical for a whole range of issues where we're at gridlock right now. And so it's an organization that had to be invented for us to be successful as a democracy, was invented, and hopefully will continue and expand in the future.
Well, thank you. My experience is a little bit different than Stuart's because I was a stakeholder in the Better Budget Process project. And so I was reached out to, and as part of the scoping exercise, at least as I understood it, and then later invited to participate. And when I was invited, after being intrigued through that scoping process, I was just so, to use your word, curious. How could they bring all these people together to take on something so intractable that meant a lot to the organization for which I work for? So I had a good professional reason to do this, though I had a lot of convincing to do for the individuals who lead our organization to make sure that it was truly relevant if I was going to invest the kind of time that I was being led to believe it would take. But it was also this personal drive that I really like seeing something that's messy and figuring out how you clean it up. And not only after you clean it up, is there something you can help build that prevents that mess in the future? So those are kind of things I saw through that scoping process and that initial invitation that intrigued me.
I would say I had a couple of. There are a couple of personal reasons I decided to participate and one professional one. In terms of the personal reasons, the first, of course, is hope, and I think folks have spoken to that. I think a deep commitment to doing my part, whatever that looks like, as a citizen to improve the issues that matter most to me in this country, and economic injustice is one of those issues I care deeply about, and so I wanted a chance to be involved and invested in whatever way I was called to. The second was trust, and I think interpersonal trust is incredibly important for this, and in that sense, I really built on my trust of Russell Crumnow, who I had come to know as colleagues in another national effort around economic opportunity. And when he took on the leadership role in the Economic Mobility Project and reached out to me, while I had a lot of misgivings, the fact that he's someone who I knew to have deep integrity was taking on this role meant a lot to me, and drew me in to ask more questions, get to know other folks on the team, and that trust grew as I got to know Convergence better. The professional reason I decided to participate was because I had briefly been involved in policy work in Washington, and actually had felt a deep sense of frustration that there was a real disconnect between the policy conversations about economic opportunity and what was happening with social service organizations, the conversations with anti-poverty organizations, and what low-income individuals across the country understood to be the solutions that would make the greatest difference in their lives. And so as someone who was at that time working in the South Bronx in an anti-poverty program, I felt that the opportunity to be a doer, a practitioner who had the chance every 6 to 8 weeks to be part of these policy conversations in Washington was meaningful and was important, and that I had something to add.
Wow, I wasn't ready for this.
Sorry. Should have warned you.
I'm going to be 100% candid, which those of you who have been in the criminal justice side of things know is not a surprise. I have yet to figure out how I was selected to join this Convergence panel. I was relatively new at ACU. While I have 30 years of public policy experience, I just started on criminal justice policy. And my choosing to join the Criminal Justice Ready Reentry Project fit into kind of two categories for me, three actually, if you want to look at me incredibly superficially. The first is knowing that I didn't know a lot and seeing the panel of people that I was going to have an opportunity to interact with. I couldn't turn it down. The folks that put together our panel at Ready Reentry really picked some of the most noteworthy thinkers, but not just academic, with all due respect, not just academics, but really practitioners, policymakers, activists. It was a who's who in my space, and I couldn't turn that down, and I was thrilled to be associated with it. It was also an opportunity because I knew just enough to be dangerous, but I also knew that the project we were taking on was a Gordian knot. You pull one strand and it tightens another strand and the knot becomes tighter. And that has been the problem with our little corner of the world on reentry. I think it's fair to say that everybody on the planet wants the right outcome, but nobody on the planet could figure out how we get from point A to point Z. And so the chance to really kind of take a step back from the day-to-day calamities that I deal with and focus and do a deep dive with colleagues that, while I didn't know then, I now call friends now, or I now call friends, was just an opportunity I couldn't pass up. And the third point was I was just plain flattered to be asked to join because I was relatively new to the space. But it has been an unbelievable opportunity, and I think we've done really good work that, as I just learned this afternoon, will continue on even though the project is winding down.
Elizabeth and Matt, this question's for the two of you. Could you describe whether something happened early on at the stakeholder table that signaled to you that this was a different kind of dialogue, a different kind of process?
So as I said, I had some misgivings or even anxiety about the first meeting. And when we came into the room and, we were set at tables with our information and our bios, and everyone was cautiously getting to know one another, I was really unsure how the next, day and a half was going to play out. I really appreciated, I think David was our facilitator throughout the process, and David had as our first big exercise, as we were talking about, the big thorny issues around economic mobility. Our first exercise was not about, any of the policy issues that were in front of us that moment, but actually invited us to envision 30 years out, and invited us to think about what was it that we wanted to see essentially for the next generation. And I could feel, and both in myself and I think in others, that we all kind of were able to exhale a little bit, like, oh, okay, you're not asking us to be in the fights that we're kind of in and used to being in this moment. You're inviting us to think about what it is that we want. And on that, there's a lot of common ground. And that was that to me was a really wonderful beginning, and became this really powerful touchstone to keep coming back to. It didn't last all the way through, right? We then had to get into some of the critical, thorny issues on which there were big disagreements. But having us start there, I think, was really important, and allowed us to have some conversations about what did connect us, and be able to have conversations across the table that allowed us to build trust, allowed us to see each other's caring, and how much we do want to find solutions, even if the ways that we might find them seem quite different right now.
So two or three things that come immediately to mind as I think about this question. One was who was in the room? And that suddenly was very different. I was used to being in a lot of settings where I'm talking to folks who may have a different perspective, but to have so many different perspectives who thought they would come to this table and start talking about what is a very fundamentally difficult problem that has enormous implications for our country. I knew something was different there. And then what really made it fascinating, and very quickly, which is really what surprised me in so many ways, was we were quickly commiserating. We were all on the same page in ways I wouldn't have suspected. We were on the same page without really attributing what the problem was to any one specific person, group, et cetera. We were just saying this is the problem. And, you can bond pretty well when you're all making fun of the same thing. And there's something to that. And obviously Convergence knows that and knew that at that moment. And then the third thing I'd state, it was both in the first meeting but more so in the second and third meetings. I knew this was going to be different. Is how fast things got candid. And what I mean by that is that I was saying things in that room, and I'll just speak for myself. I was saying things in that room I wouldn't have normally said in a bigger professional setting about my perspectives on the issue at hand, how we got there, and things of that nature. There's risk, of course, in being candid. And again, I think that speaks to the secret sauce, is the environment that's created, that people felt that comfortable. And again, I'll speak for myself and give my own example, but I was not alone. That people got candid really quickly. I would have thought maybe that was going to happen in meeting 5, 6, 8, 10, or whatever it was going to be. And we met 14 times. So that's a lot of discussion. We got there really, really quickly from my point of view.
David, how, if at all, did your attitude toward ideas, stakeholders from the other side, so to speak, begin to change throughout the process? And if they did, in fact, evolve, what do you attribute that to?
So let me just set the stage, because if you were to look at the roster of the reentry project, you would think there were some stark battle lines. We had liberal reformers, we had conservative reformers, we had representatives of the corrections officers, and we had prison administrators. Experts in very narrow areas, esoteric areas like prisoner health care and education, and guys that were generalists. But what I found was we all had the same kind of longer-term goal. We all knew that if somebody goes to prison and they go out unprepared, they will, sure as God made little green apples, reoffend and go back. And we could all agree on that fundamental problem. And that problem statement really was what drove us. Over the time, given the amount of time we spent together, I think everybody kind of dropped their armor. I didn't have to, be the conservative pit bull, and my friends on the other side didn't have to be the bleeding heart liberals. It was something where we were all, as we were exchanging ideas, we were also really becoming respected friends. And it was really the environment that allowed us to do that. And once, the prior panel said it's hard to hate up close, Not that in policy we hate, but when you're in a room talking through issues as deeply as we were, it was hard not to respect the other side's perspective. And that allowed us to drop our armor and go, I get this. Let's see how we can advance it in a way that satisfies all the stakeholders. So I think it's the intimacy of the approach that really allowed the people, at least in our task force, to gel and move the ball down the field.
Kelly and Stuart, Kelly, with your depth of sustained engagement with Education Reimagined, and Stuart, with the breadth of project experiences you've had with Convergence, could each of you describe what you saw as some breakthrough moments during the project process?
So in our first meeting, we brought we had our diverse stakeholder group, they came together to reimagine education. And the way that we had identified people is people who really wanted to imagine education if we had not inherited the current system and we could invent from a blank slate. And so people had to come in agreeing that whatever was going to come out on the other side might not include the things that they were most passionate about to come to the table. So they knew that the goal was to not have the same conversation that we've always had. And when we got into the room together, we were engaging folks and having a different kind of conversation, but it kept happening that somebody would say X, and then another person in the room would say, I know I'm not supposed to respond in the traditional way, but when you say that, I have to say this. And so for the first day, that kept happening. And so at that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know if we're going to make it through to the end, or even to meeting 2, frankly, or day 2. I wasn't even sure. And then on day 2, the group came back together and we had a conversation about focusing in on the future. Like, where do we want to be in 18 months as a consequence of having reimagined education? Like, what's at stake here? And is it worth actually continuing to tackle this? So people got re-energized, recommitted, really that this could be a monumental policy-changing and life-changing group for education for kids. And then the insight that came from several of the participants was they started to notice that there was something inside of each one of us that keeps the conversation in the exact same way. So they decided that they were also willing to do the introspection and to discover where they were holding on to things that were causing the, you say X, I have to say Y. And then we were off to the races.
Yes, let me answer that in a broad context, and then I'll give you just one very quick example. And the broad context is that it's very important to understand, to remember, that the whole process we use is a very professional facilitation process. We have people like David Fairman, Pat Field. We have people like David Fairman, Pat Field, and others here whose job is, their day's job is how to facilitate successful negotiation to get to yes. They understand the techniques that are necessary to do that. And you've already heard a couple of them. One is that sometimes it's much better to get people to think about the future rather than the things that divide them right. Kelly, of course, knows that. I think this is running out of battery, actually. But anyway, you've heard that sort of in the education process, that was one of the major breakthroughs, to get people to stop thinking about the immediate and say, what do they have in common in the future? Getting people to know each other in different ways is crucial. And a critical first stage success of any project is to get that relationship to develop. And it can be done in a variety of ways. One is that when you go out for dinner after the first meeting, it's important who sits next to whom. We have people sometimes at an initial meeting who will literally not look each other in the eye. We've had, for example, people from private prisons and people who've been in prison find it real hard to talk to each other. Put them next together with a nice bottle of, actually the best to use is California Pinot, I've discovered. But to get them together, they've got to talk about something. And they're going to start talking about their kids, their pets, the nationals, or whatever it happens to be. And it's a critical stage to get people to think in this, to act differently to each other. The particular example I'll give you, which is common to a lot of our projects, is one of the first things we tend to do in projects, before we get into anything, is to go around the table and ask people why this is important to them personally. Never mind who they represent. Why is it personally very important to them? And what that tends to do, we've had projects where at one level, everybody knows each other. They come from stakeholder organizations that meet, that testify, and so on. But they really don't know each other. In the long-term care project, that's what we did. We went around and said, why is this important to you personally? And everybody had a story about a parent, a loved one in some way. People teared up in talking about this. And so when you've got somebody who represents the insurance industry, and the other people in the room think, oh, insurance industry, right? I know what that person thinks about everything. And that person tears up about their mother. You've changed the relationship completely. So that's always a critical piece, I think, of almost every project that I've been involved in. The technique used to make the personal relationship front and center. Once you've done that, and I think once you've got people to think beyond the immediate, as we did in all the projects you've heard here, about how do they envision the future and the similarity, you're off to a totally different kind of chemistry than the traditional negotiation argument that pervades Washington, where literally people do not know each other.
Can I make an observation? So, as a stakeholder, it's so funny because you just said something. You just gave one of the ingredients of the secret sauce, right? And that is where people sit. And I will tell you, as a stakeholder, we'd be participating, and by the third, fourth meeting, we're like, so they're assigning us seats. There's a reason here. And so we, the stakeholders, just go, what is in Convergence's mind here? What are they thinking here?
It's an algorithm.
Yes, it's very important, but it's part of the sauce.
Absolutely.
Kelly talked about the anxiety that day two might not actually come after day one when Education Reimagined, prior Reimagining Education kicked off. Would love to hear from each of you about a moment that you found particularly challenging over the course of the process you're involved in. We know that the convergence process doesn't unfold in a linear, clean way, and that there are inevitably moments of impasse, moments of doubt. I'd be curious to hear each of you describe one of those challenges. Maybe Elizabeth, would you like to start us?
Sure. There were plenty of moments at the table, meaning, across the 6 meetings or so, where there was significant disagreement on policy matters, particularly in our economic mobility group. I think we separated into 3 different areas, and talking about what work quality or what a good job looked like was hard. I wasn't in that group all the time. I spent more time with the workforce development group, but I know that the conversations there were thorny and required continuing to come back to what the goals were and lots of conversation in between. But some of the conversations that were challenging also happened at dinner across, with Pinot Noir or whatever the case may be. And I hesitate to share this example, but I want to be in the spirit of vulnerability and candor. There was a stakeholder, there was a dinner and a set of conversations that we were having about the current political moment. I think our period was between about 2015 and 2017, a lot going on. And I personally, I live in New York City. My own political education and political upbringing have caused me to be involved in work just as a regular citizen, really concerned about the issue of police brutality in America. And so I sometimes participate in Black Lives Matter protests in my time. I think it's a critical issue. And I mentioned that somehow over dinner, and ended up getting into a pretty heated argument with another member of the stakeholder group who compared Black Lives Matter to the Ku Klux Klan. That was really hard. We were at the table. There were others at the table. There were a number of reactions that I considered. Certainly, but felt most importantly that, so I'll say a couple of things. One, I think that was probably around the 3rd or 4th meeting. I had enough trust in the others, even though I didn't necessarily know everyone at the table really well, but I had enough trust that I wasn't completely alone, right? And that I could actually respond quite calmly and use it as an opportunity, I hoped, to share learning. Right, and to share my experience and to share actually, why I see those as quite different kinds of organizations, and precisely why. Not in a long, it wasn't meant to be a history lesson, but I did share personal experience and why the context really matters. And I also was able to share why that comment was so difficult. We ended up, we continued to sit next to each other. We finished our meal. We, each went back to respective hotels, and then I think that was a day 1, and then there was day 2 the next day. And the next day we talked about it. He and I had a conversation before the meeting started, had a conversation about that, and proceeded to go through the rest of the process, not as best friends, but certainly as colleagues. And we're able to move through that. And I don't know that in every setting, professional or personal, that would be possible. I credit something about the convergence process as having enough of attention to trust that allowed that to play out and allowed us to be able to move forward, and would also, credit us individually for being able to move through that interaction, which could have been quite difficult.
While not as personal as your experience, I would say the most challenging point we had was in the context of race. I don't think it is a state secret that race is a critical issue in the criminal justice system and one of the reasons why reforms have to be made. The challenge I had coming from my personal perspective is that not every answer to every problem has to have front and center a racial component. And I'll be candid, race issues make me uncomfortable. Not people of color make me uncomfortable, but the discussion of race issues. And I don't think I'm alone in this room or in our room when we were working on reentry. I find them uncomfortable because I'm not sure what to do about it, to be candid. And it became a little bit of a challenge as we went on because while we all had concepts that we agreed upon, they were put in the context of race. At least they were proffered that way. And so I and Fairman can probably, I'm not on Fairman's Christmas list, I'm sure, because I was the skunk at the garden party. I was the guy that said, okay, how is this going to get us to the end result? I know it's cathartic to talk about race, but it doesn't get us to the point where we have recommendations that are substantive and executable and realistic. And that, I kind of reverted to that, conservative ass a lot and, being a pit bull, making my views clear. And we had some good dialogue about it, and I think we worked through it in a way that was constructive. But, if we got wrapped around the axle on race, we never would have gotten to a final set of recommendations that I think we all can be proud of. And I agree with you, Elizabeth. The environment that Convergence put together made it not easy, but easier to work through that in a way where we could all be true to our own selves and our viewpoints, but at the same time respectful of others. And it wasn't perfect, it wasn't smooth, it wasn't always pleasant or enjoyable, but it got the job done.
Matt?
So I'll speak mostly in terms of my perceptions and what became most challenging, and not so much for the group and not nearly as profound as what we've just heard. But we went through this process, again, trying to figure out how to make the budget process work. And we did it in the spirit of, we know this will be good for the country, because if the budget process can function, because everything is touched by the budget, then actually maybe better decision-making will happen, and we'll make some of the policy decisions that need to be made in this country because the process is working. They realized they could work together. And that's what framed our thinking, I think is a fair way to describe that. So imagine going through that, and we're toiling and we're asking tough questions of each other and challenging each other at times. And I think we're making a lot of progress. And we get towards the end, and this is probably meeting 10, 11 or something of that nature. And there's really a disagreement with respect to a part of the budget process and how we tackle it. And it is, from my perception, was coming mostly along what one would be partisan lines about how one uses it. And that's fine. And maybe we could agree we won't make that part of our set of recommendations because we couldn't reach consensus. But what was so disappointing and hence so challenging was that there were comments made after, again, so much time into the process that was attributing a motive that was extremely negative towards one person's point of view. And then that happened again from the other side. And so it was this inflection point, at least from my perspective. It's like, well, how are we going to bridge this? This has been simmering the whole time. And how do you get over that? Because when you start not giving people the benefit of the doubt from their perspective, it's going to make it really, really hard to get past this, because it might be corrosive to the rest of what we were trying to agree to. But the good news is we got through that. And for lack of a better term, I think some folks kind of hugged it out. They realized that there were comments made that, that was outside the bounds of how we were trying to operate and get things done. And a second, I'm sure it's probably a challenge at times for some of the projects, much more minor. But there were moments where it's like, wow, there's not as many people around the table as I'd hoped for this particular conversation. So instead of having all 24, we only had 11. That's really tough. Are we going to be able to keep moving this forward? But we would kind of push through, and we'd pick those folks up because there were certain voices, I think it's fair to say, we were expecting to hear. We really needed that perspective because people knew that if we didn't have that voice in the mix at the right times, some of this was tenuous and it might fall apart. But again, I think the repetition helped ultimately through getting us, trying to keep us back at that table.
Kelly?
I was just going to share that there were many really challenging conversations where there was a lot of disagreement. So if that's not obvious, that once you form a relationship, it's not that it's all smooth sailing. What it means is that people are willing to actually have some of the conflict emerge at the appropriate time with the attitude of actually working through it. And you know, our group has now been together for 5+ years because they started as a dialogue and then they launched an organization called Education Reimagined, and we're still working. So I'm going to point out John Wright, who's one of the participants from the VP of Strategy at NEA. But you know, we had to also, through all of this, launch an organization, but at each time you could have the conversation, and sometimes you knew, and this is what John said the other day, sorry to quote you while you're sitting there, but once you build a relationship, not everything that somebody says do you need to argue with. Like, you start to get to know them, and you start, and it stops being like, oh my gosh, they said that, I must go after them. And there are times when you have to say, wait, what you just said, we can't move past, and we now have to have a conversation about it. But it also doesn't change your view of, like, they're still family. They're still part of the community, and you're still going to go on working together.
Stuart, if I could ask you a different question as we start to pivot to a different part of our session. We know that the convergence process is about dialogue leading to action. Several of you have talked about the different stages that projects are in and moving towards implementation or long-term implementation. Stuart, if you could describe about any of the projects that you've been a part of, what you see as the most promising kinds of impact that have emerged.
You know, I think it's interesting that almost all of our projects, we are kind of neutral at the beginning in terms of how we think the project will achieve an impact. We don't go in with a sort of a cookie-cutter view. Well, there's got to be a report. It's got to be 50 pages long. It's got to be this. Part of the secret of this is the project members themselves take ownership of the project. The facilitators and the managers of the project, like Kelly and like David Fairman and others, they're there to facilitate and to get us to success. But the nature of that may differ significantly from one project to another, and I think we've seen this a lot. The education project, of course, that Kelly just mentioned, is now in its 5th year in that sense. The group decided to not only to reach an agreement, but to go out and to advocate this, to go and persuade parts of the country to adopt a lot of their recommendations. So that's kind of one approach. The budget process project ended up with a set of recommendations, but then the group themselves said, we can take these recommendations as stakeholders, as people who are known on Capitol Hill, and go out and encourage others to agree to them. And that's, in fact, been part of the process since that project, and it continues today. There are a lot of budget process ideas, and I'm involved in this with wearing a different hat at Brookings, where I work on the budget process. When we're asked by members of Congress and committees to say, well, what ideas are out there? What we can do is point to the not only to the report of the Convergence project, but to say, and you'll find some really interesting people who you would not expect to be rallying around this particular idea, and let's have them come up and talk to you. And that's the key. So when we think about these projects, at some particular point, we then start thinking with the members of the project itself, what is the deliverable? What is the impact? How do we imagine that? We're seeing this with the Reentry Ready project in terms of looking at a couple of specific states that are saying this makes a lot of sense for us, states that had stakeholders at the table. And so there's a follow-up of looking at how can we get that implemented in those particular states as pilots, then to get other states to go down the same road. So what I'm really trying to say is that there's a consciousness throughout the project, once it really gets going, that we're not just there to have an agreement and shake hands and then disappear and go down our own way. We think about what is the long-term impact, but that differs depending on the particular project. And it's really important to get the stakeholders to be really invested in that, to think about that. And that is very often a very key part of the sort of the final stages of any project. How do you go forward?
Thank you. Stuart mentioned the integral role that David Fairman has played over the course of many Convergence projects as an expert facilitator. And we are now going to turn to David to share a few reflections of his own.
You should join us at the podium.
Please come on up.
Don't be shy.
Because a lot of wonderful things have already been said. Thanks. The first thing I want to say is the mic is not on. Okay. The second thing I want to say is thank you to Rob first. Rob, where are you? Okay. Yeah. Although it is too early to roast you, Rob, I think it. Yeah, thank you. We probably do a quick, just round the room on that. The thing that I want to say about what I have learned starts with Rob and starts with the importance of relationship building and trust building and how profoundly important that is to all of these processes. And I would say my learning in these 4 Convergence dialogues that I have helped to facilitate has been a process of downward mobility from head to heart and gut. And I think that it's, for someone like me who loves to get into the substantive issues and think of them as negotiable and think about the ways in which groups could work together to come up with puzzle solutions, the most important thing I have learned with and from Rob and with all of the stakeholders is that for most of the issues that Convergence deals with and most of the issues that are most divisive in our society, we don't lack for viable policy options. We lack for trust and relationship and willingness to work together. And because that is what we most lack, Convergence processes have taught me the importance of going slower at the beginning in order to build up the capacity to work well together when it gets difficult, as has been beautifully illustrated by these colleagues on the panel. The second thing that I have learned is navigating without a roadmap. Relative to most of the work that I have done in my career, Convergence processes are outrageously as Stuart mentioned, it's not exactly a wing and a prayer, but you've talked to a bunch of people, you've sort of conveyed to them what you hope will be achieved. They've said, yes, we hope that can be achieved too. They're willing to come to the table. You have sketched for them in, I would say, remarkably vague terms, the idea that this will progress from dialogue toward action, and then you're in the room and you're trying to figure it out. And yes, it is true that we have some tools as facilitators to help structure that process. But relative to most of the things that I and my organization work on, these Convergence processes have a profoundly creative element in them as the stakeholders themselves discover with our help, but certainly not because we knew it up front, what way to structure the conversation is actually going to help them make the most progress on the substantive issues. And in the mobility process, we discovered that we really had 3 topics. It took us 2 meetings to figure out what the 3 topics were, and then the stakeholders themselves sorted themselves. In the reentry ready process, it turned out to be extremely important to address first principles because there was such depth of concern from different stakeholders about the principles that they held dear when it came to criminal justice that if we had tried to move in a different direction, if we had said, let's go imagine a future where everybody is reentering successfully, it wouldn't have worked unless and until we had clarified that first. So I just want to acknowledge how wonderful it has been to learn what is possible when the stakeholders and the project directors and the team work together to chart that course. And I'd say the last thing that I think is wonderful as a learning for me from these convergence processes is the possibility of, as Stuart said, figuring out where the power of the group lies to take the results, the fruits of their effort forward in the process. That is, we don't know going in, we sort of know midstream, and then I would just say we usually have to start asking the question, where do you think this can have impact, about halfway through? Because stakeholders, it is remarkable to me how much trust they place in us to have a sense of what the answer to that question is going to be, and how we do have to bring it up repeatedly and help people start to really talk about the fact that, oh, it's not Convergence who's going to take this out in the world. If anybody's going to take this out in the world, it's going to be you. We can help you figure out the best way, but we don't know it and we can't do it for you. And stakeholders recognizing that, having the experience of, okay, and it's completely bespoke. We are who we are. There is no other group like us. We are unique. Therefore, we do have to figure out what we as individuals and the organizations and the networks that we have can do. And each time, in a different way, the stakeholders have. They have figured it out, and they have been able to have impact. I would be the first to grant variable impact, and these issues are tough ones, and just bringing a strong group together to bring it out in the world doesn't mean we move the needle immediately. So just to say those things and to say how important to our country it is that this work continue, that both the process and the outcomes become more visible as an inspiration, and not that we have all the answers, but that our society needs to know, and how wonderful it is to see this room of people who have direct experience in being in these processes and understand how important it is for all of us to work together to bring the work forward. So thanks very, very much for that.
Thank you, David. Let's open up the conversation more broadly. We know there's other project stakeholders in the room. If you want to share reflections, we welcome those. If you have questions for our panelists, we welcome that as well. John.
Hi, everyone. John Jacob. Thanks so much for this incredibly interesting panel. We heard Linda and Bill and Linda talk about the importance of starting from the same facts. And I wonder if you guys could reflect on whether there were any issues you experienced in the groups on getting to the same set of facts. Thank you.
I can actually give you a very specific example of that, which is also linked to a breakthrough point. And that is the project on long-term care financing. Karen Hademan was the manager of that particular project. And that was an issue where the idea was, or the question was, how can we make sure that as people age and become more infirm, that financially they can feel secure? And there were differences from the get-go of approach, the long-held approach. People who wanted a big social insurance program, kind of an expansion of Medicare, for example. Others who said, no, it's got to be the private sector, and so on. There was a lot of disagreement. And the problem we faced was actually a dispute over the facts. Not because people said, one set of people had facts and other people just had, phony facts. It wasn't that. It was that we really did not have very well developed models in this area to predict what the impact of a particular proposal would look like. In some areas like taxation and others, there's very sophisticated models that we use in the public policy area. And you can have a discussion, but you can have facts put on the table about this would be the result of this particular approach. We did not have that. And for a while, that was an impasse. How do we move forward? Where very reasonable people said, well, we don't know what the result is of this, and so how can we get agreement? So one of the things that stakeholders themselves did, and the funders of the project did, was to say, we actually have to invest in building a model to answer this question. So for many months, actually for almost a year, I think it was, the Urban Institute, which is another competing think tank to Brookings in the Washington area, but developed a model to help these different proposals be tested out. That had a significant effect on the whole conversation in that, because certain ideas, including some I have to admit that I had about how to move forward, once you actually could get something close to facts through projections, really clearly didn't make the cut. And so that's an example of where there was actually a dispute about facts. The group as a whole said, how do we resolve this problem? By developing a way of getting the facts. And that altered the debate and helped us come to agreement about what the solution should be.
So I had a different experience with our panel. Unlike the insane asylum down the street that it's the U.S. Capitol, I think everybody had essentially agreement on the factual underpinnings of our challenge. Where we struggled wasn't a debate about facts as much as it was a debate about priorities and what was attainable. And so in some ways that was easier because once we all got kind of up to the same knowledge base, particularly on some of these really nuanced topics like Medicaid reimbursement or, case management systems, things like that, it made it easier for us to get through it. But the challenge after that point was, well, what's doable? What's within the realm of reason? The blessing in that is that it is much easier to have a debate about priorities, I think, than it is to say, well, your facts are wrong and my facts are right. And I think once we got to that point, yeah, we were still bumps in the road, but it was not as challenging as I would have expected.
So for the better budget process, I don't know that we disagreed on the facts per se. I think there were disagreements at times about how certain things happened in the budget process in the past. And so some might consider that a fact, that this party was responsible for its breakdown, or that party was responsible for that breakdown, or this politician and so forth. But we were able to sort through that. But there was something else about facts that I think is worth noting, because I do think it's, again, go back to the title of our session and noting the secret sauce. And that is, we learned together. And so we actually established a core set of facts together. And there was a particular exercise that we did, and I thought it was brilliant in retrospect, is we went all the way back and said, what if all you have to create a new budget process is the Constitution? And so we had to wrestle with that. And we had to then sort through what we thought were facts in our heads about what we thought was a fact about the process as we know it, and what the Constitution. So some of us had misconceptions about what the Constitution said or didn't say. Basically, it didn't say much, let's be clear. And everything's been made since then. So then we had to talk about the 1974 Act, from which much of our budget process is predicated upon, and different types of acts, and work through that. So then we had a shared set of facts that we learned together. And so for me, the takeaway was about the process and the secret sauce is that learning together is actually extremely powerful. And I think about the context in which I work for research universities. And, think about the relationships you have with people, the people you sat next to in a classroom, whether it was in higher education or elementary school. You bonded with folks in that as you learned. And I think there's something really powerful about building the trust that I think all of us have been talking about on this panel that helped that along, because we had shared facts.
Question in the back there?
How about now? Oh, wow. I'm Rachel Fersh, Convergence DNA recipient. So I have a question. I know David, I think, sat back down, but the point that you made about results and how you really only got into who would be responsible for the impact halfway through the process, I think when we talk about convergence, the thing most people want to hear about who aren't familiar with the process is whether it works. And then you go backward from there about how you got there, which isn't necessarily, I think, the value that some of the people in the room see, but that's the reality. And I'm curious whether the participants know going in that they themselves will be responsible for creating the impact that comes out of it, and the participants can speak to whether they were informed of that, or whether there's value to actually not hiding that, but to waiting to reveal that element of it so that it is more about the process and then organically goes to the results.
I'm not a participant, but having recruited people to be at a table, it was actually quite the reverse, that they wanted me to promise that results were going to come out of the process. And I remember Becky Pringle in particular, the vice president of NEA, having that conversation with me, along with many others, saying, like, is this going to result in a paper that sits on a shelf? Because if it is, I'm not interested. If it is going to lead to something and make a difference, I'm in. And so we all had to be on the line, and it wasn't just me. I said, and I was clear with all of them from the very beginning. This will only make an impact if you're going to be committed to it too. And so we were all in it, I would say, completely together at the beginning. And I'm not sure that's the same for all projects.
Maya?
I've always been curious about the speed of the process and the sort of the concept of efficiency, and have been reminded of the quote, change happens at the speed of trust. And I'm really wondering, because a lot of people are, how long is it going to take? What does it mean? Is it faster to just make hierarchical decisions in the way that many organizations do? What your thoughts are, if there's any empirical evidence, or what your anecdotal thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that truism is particularly apt for this process. I think I don't think if you took all of the hours that we did commit, and I think again our process was 6 to 7 meetings. I don't think if you condensed all of that into us coming together for 1 week, you would have had the same result. And I think the result we had over the longer period was better. And I think it was better for a few reasons. One, we were able to build trust, do some homework, do some shared learning in between the meetings. I think we were able to, in our case, use some of those time in between meetings to intentionally hear from other stakeholders whose voices we may have been representing in some ways with our organizations, but actually made a real commitment to say, well, actually, let's take some of the critical questions we're wrestling with between meetings and have those in focus group conversations, some of which we videotaped or had some of the Convergence participants on the phone with us. I think that was really important. It happened between meetings. But I also think, even though we're talking a lot about the importance of the relationships and the intimacy that happens in the 2 days that we're together each time, we are all here because we want to make change. We're all here because we care about these issues enough and feel that what is happening inside of our own organizations and the way we're making change is good but insufficient to get to the kind of big change that we need. And in that sense, I think the passage of time that, where we are deeply engaged with the political system as it currently exists, warts and all, is meaningful for having us then be able to come back and say, okay, well, here's what we're learning, or here's what we've just seen or experienced within our own organizations. Let's figure out that next step together, which we need to take, that additional question we need to wrestle with as this group, or the new political opportunity on the horizon, right? I mean, I think in our case, we probably began with some high expectations about what might be possible from the federal government when we took this on, with a sense that economic mobility was absolutely one of the most important issues that we would take on together, and that there was perhaps a chance for some common ground, at least on some of the issues like workforce development. But after the 2016 election, that no longer felt like it was going to be possible in the immediate term. And so the time in between, I think, helped a lot of stakeholders, particularly at the state level and the business stakeholders, say, okay, we have to take this seriously in a different way in terms of where the solutions might come. The solutions are going to be, let's look at some pilot demonstrations that can happen at the state level. Let's look at the roles that businesses can play immediately in terms of their own workforce around some of these issues. And I don't think we would have done that just in 10 days together in, early 2016. We wouldn't have ended in the same place.
And I would just, and I completely agree with everything Elizabeth said. What I would say, though, is that there was another dimension to having that intensive 2-day session, including Pinot and bourbon, and then stepping back and reflecting and internalizing kind of what we all heard, and then meshed that with what our own kind of internal value system and priorities were. And so after, 60 or 90 days after we would have the first meeting, we'd come back together, and I would be able to turn the problem set over in my mind and come up with maybe a slightly different solution that I could proffer, or at least something to contribute. So that time, this would not work if they locked everybody in a room for 20 days and said, come up with a solution. It just wouldn't. It allowed us, what's the old Louisiana line about how you cook a frog? You don't put them in a pot of boiling water because they jump out. You put them in cold water and slowly heat it up. It's a little bit like that. We had to have those ideas in cold water and slowly heat it up.
That's the secret sauce. Frogs.
It's, can I just make a very quick kind of comment on what you just heard? Because it's important to contrast sort of the model of getting to agreement, which is if we just get everybody to a summit, over the weekend, we can hammer it out. That's a very common feeling in Washington about how you get agreement. They don't tend to last too well, even if there's an agreement. And so this process, and the typical project lasts, a year to 18 months. That, first of all, you've often got to accommodate people's schedules. We're talking about very senior people in organizations that can't block out, a full week or 2 weeks. You've also got, as Elizabeth said, and others have said, stuff has got to kind of seep in over time. People got to wrestle with things. Then another thing I just want to emphasize is a lot goes on between meetings. And all of those, Russell, Karen, all this, that project leaders know this very well. There's a lot of shuttle diplomacy going on, where you get a sense at the end of a meeting, there's a collision point here, and we've got to figure out how to resolve this. That may take several weeks of conversation. So that's going on. A lot of sometimes drafting is going on. There's a lot going on between meetings. So it's a very long process. And I think that's critical to success. It is critical to success. And contrasts, I think, with the sort of the hurry-up vision. If we just get everybody together and close the doors and give no bathroom breaks and this kind of thing, somehow everybody will just see it. That really does not happen too often.
Just a very small addition to that is to David's point that this is very emergent. We actually don't know where the dialogue is going next after a 2-day thing. It's then, let's see what happened and where we're going to take it. And if we had to plan it all out in advance, we would have to know where it was going to end, and we don't.
Amanda?
I'm curious about the impact of going through the process on you, and to what extent, if at all, any of these elements of the secret sauce that we've been talking about have had an influence on you in your organizations or in your colleagues, in your networks with other organizations.
I'm happy to start. It definitely has had an influence. I have always cared so deeply about participatory systems and approaches to solving problems. And I was involved, as I mentioned, in an anti-poverty organization when I started the Convergence process, and actually felt a great deal of gratification that one of the models that we have adopted in the South Bronx, which is something I shared at the Convergence, at our Working Up group, that model and that approach actually found its way into the final recommendations in some way. And while that work continues and is incredibly important, I think having taken that from a pilot model in the South Bronx to framing it as a possibility for part of a national solution was both very gratifying for me and for my colleagues in the South Bronx, but also helped me really think about what my next steps look like in terms of my further evolution towards structural change. And so I actually, about a year ago, took on the role leading a new organization, which in many ways does have elements of a grassroots convergence. We, engage a number of coalitions in New York City on some critical issues like immigrant rights, tenants' rights, and we're thinking about long-term building trust with different kinds of stakeholders who do not all have the same role in the solution, but all who talking together and working together more effectively can help the solution be longer lasting and more impactful with community members. For me, moving towards that role absolutely had something to do with some of the conversations that we engage in as a part of, that I engage in as a part of the Convergence process. So it certainly was impactful for me personally.
So similarly, it definitely had both a personal and a professional impact on me. I think it's fair to say, as I approached and my involvement in Convergence, I'd had some experience in facilitating some things on my own as part of my day job. I've also had a little bit of formal training and understanding this, but I'd never seen it done in such an incredibly thoughtful way. And again, I'm still learning right now how much was underneath all of that. And so the impact on me was, again, seeing everybody come together. You wouldn't think that would happen, and getting to a consensus outcome. That was really important and had an impact. But there were just some simple things along the way that, again, I think I knew, but I didn't understand how they work together. And they are, one, don't judge a book by its cover. I mean, it's a conventional phrase. I know we all know it, but you got to learn and live it and really feel it. And I think that was really reinforced in this process for me. Two, I spoke to it earlier. This notion, it's so easy, especially in our culture and especially in this city, to ascribe a negative motive to what people's actions or their comments are. And just slowing down and giving that benefit of the doubt. And the last one was literally just talked about, and that is understanding that, boy, time and space really, really matter when you're trying to tackle something that's hard and can be people are passionate about and have deep emotions and feelings. Because if you don't allow that, you're just going to skirt right over the top of it, and you're not going to get people to have that candor that's going to be necessary to get to agreement. And so those are the things that I personally have taken away from my participation in the project and that I'm trying to find ways to incorporate more in my own life.
We have time for one more question. Please, Julie.
Actually,
We want it back.
I'll give you that. You'll let go. So my question kind of builds on the previous question, and also to the point that was made at the earlier panel. How, as participants of this process, how do you see taking some of these ideas, these ways of engagement, more to a grassroots level, where you're dealing with the big problems, the ones that we read about in the Washington Post, but in communities, and when we think about rebuilding communities and rebuilding community trust, how do you see that playing out? What are some ways that you think that could be helpful? Well, the way it's played out for Education Reimagined is that we now have a community of over 600 people who have come together across difference, and that is just continually growing. So we bring people from charter district schools, from out-of-school time, all of the different divides. We have philanthropy and higher ed and employers, and so the way that our project worked, kind of the next step was to continue to do this bridge building and continue in our minds helping build a movement for this. So that's one way it can happen. And the other thing was in the recommendations for what, in our case, education was going to look like. It was incumbent. It needed a shared vision at a local site. And so part of the recommendations were that people come together to have a shared vision across diversity in their site as they start to build a new model.
Let me put my board member hat on for a moment. I mean, this is something we're thinking very much about at Convergence. How do we take this secret sauce and how do we enable it to occur around the country in some way, either directly within communities or maybe at the state level and so on. And as a board, we're thinking very hard about this and planning for this right now. Everything from, we do have some projects that it's not at the community level, but at the state level, particularly in California with a health project, which is kind of doing what we're doing at the national level, but at the state level. We've been invited and thinking about ways to help sort of teach the secret sauce in some kind of consulting way with people at the grassroots level and so on. So we're actively thinking about this. It's a very good question, which we struggle with because there's only so much we can do, and we've got to think of ways of doing that. I think the other thing I just wanted to say, which is not exactly your question, but I think it's important to get this point across, with regard to Congress. There's a reason we had Derek Kelmer come in today, because he's not alone, as he implied. Underneath the noise, the division, there's a lot of opportunity for the techniques that we're using to help guide what happens on the Hill. That's why the Bipartisan Policy Working Group has invited us to work with them. I think also, and I'll give you a fact, which is an important one to just remember, which is that despite all the noise and the gridlock on Capitol Hill, the number of major bills that go through the Congress with bipartisan support is about the same now as it's always been. Underneath the radar, a lot of things go on that people generally don't know. There have been two major health bills, for example, one making big changes to the Medicare program, so-called Chronic Act and so forth. Bipartisan, under the radar, you probably didn't even know about it. There's a lot of opportunity here. So the techniques that we're using, I think both, as you asked, apply well below the federal level in communities, and we're exploring exactly how best to do that and to encourage that. But also within the Congress, there's a lot more opportunity, and there's a desire for it. And so I think you're going to see a lot more impact in terms of what actually passes as legislation as a result of the techniques that we're using and helping members of Congress to appreciate and to figure out ways to work together more closely.
So with that, we need to wind down. I want to thank Stuart, Matt, Elizabeth, Kelly, David for your candid, thoughtful insights, the window into the secret sauce, and just as much for the inspiration that you shared around what's possible and what's actually happening for us to find common ground amidst our differences. So I really appreciate it.